I was having a conversation today with a Russian colleague. We were talking about a guy called Nikolai Ganin and trying to understand where he's coming from. In the course of that conversation, it became apparent that um, something really important needs to be emphasized about the process of doing hand reading and studying hand reading. And it seems to be a mistake that's commonly held by a lot of hand readers, particularly palmists who tend to focus on the importance of the lines. And in focusing on the importance of the lines, what they tend to overlook is that the lines are not the most important things in the hands to consider. So I'm going to talk now about the relative merits of the different parts of the hand. And as you can see from the screen, if you want to divide hand reading into sort of three main sort of topics, there's the morphology or shape of the hand, there are the lines of the hand, and then there are the dermatoglyphics, the fingerprint patterns. So this I'm going to just address this particular question because it's actually really important, and I think it's one of the things that without this proper apprehension creates a lot of problems in people's understanding of the hand and how to interpret and how to read hands. So if you look at the history of hand reading prior to the 19th century, almost the entire focus and attention was on the lines of the hand. If you look at chiromancy or palmistry, historically speaking, whether that's in the European traditions or the Indian traditions, then nearly the entire concern is with the lines or the markings on the hand, and often very much the very small subsidiary line markings are not even the major lines of the hand. It's quite obvious from looking at the drawings that were made of the hand. So back in those days, they didn't even accurately draw the main lines of the hand because they just didn't look at them. They were looking for shapes and signs and crosses and letters M and W and O's and all sorts of things like that. That's what they were looking for in the hand. They were looking for the little signs and symbols. The revival of hand reading in the 19th century, starting with Da Pontigny, but arguably also when you look at more scientific characters like Gustav Carus, were interested in the morphology of the hand. And this kind of followed a kind of an interest in the general physiognomy of the human body, which was a kind of preoccupation of what was called anthropometrics, which was basically the measurement of the human body and looking at the shape and the form of the body and what that could reveal about the internal workings of human consciousness. So a similar subject that kind of arose around that time was phrenology, which was looking at the shape of the skull and the bumps of the skull and trying to decide what that would indicate about the functioning of the person's brain and therefore the character and personality that they had. And similarly, in the study of mental health, mental illness, in the lunatic asylums of the 19th century, they just basically put everybody together, but the observations of different types of mental disorders thrown into one sort of prison type environment. There was obviously clarity about some characteristics were very physically similar. An obvious example of that is something like Down syndrome, which has got very distinctive physiological facial characteristics and other features of their body that make them all have a general similarity of appearance, which is easily identifiable and recognizable. So the context of hand reading in the 19th century, particularly with Da Pontigny, was to look at the morphognomy of the hand, which is the hand shape, the shape of the palm, the shape of the fingers, whether they're knotty or long or smooth, or whether they've got what type of tip shapes they've got, and also considering the fleshiness of the palm as well, which would be to do with the mounts. Again, the mounts were not that important in medieval and Renaissance chiromancy. They're not even discussed a lot. They're just used as labels, really. So they were interested in like a circle on the mount of the moon or something like that, but they were just identifying where the circle is. They weren't actually paying much attention to the size and shape of the mount. That's something that came in the 19th century. And the arch exponent of that, of course, is William Benham, who developed his entire palmistry system based upon the elevation of the mounts, and an entirely flawed system it is as well. Similarly with Da Pontigny, with his hand shape classifications, he's got 7 types of hand shapes that he classifies, and in the end of the day, he says most hand shapes are mixed, which is kind of like, so he's got 6 categories and then the mixed type, and so by having a mixed type of category, he completely undermines the validity of his entire system. And then, of course, at the same time, they also were trying to revive the medieval chiromantic viewpoint. So you get people like Debarol, who's imposing sort of Kabbalistic ideas upon the palm, and trying to interpret lines from that particular perspective. But they were bringing together the remnants of what was the residues of what was remembered from Renaissance and medieval palmistry, bring that together with the morphology, the morphological studies of the shape of the hand, and what became called the new chirology or the new palmistry, which was essentially the revival of palmistry during the 19th century. But in all of those cases, they did not look at fingerprint patterns, and it's quite extraordinary that they didn't even consider the fingerprint patterns, given that fingerprint patterns were discovered, first written about in about 1823. I mean, they'd been observed since the 1680s, but no one had really done a decent thesis on them until Jan Perkenji in 1823. And Henry Folds and William Herschel had been doing their own studies into fingerprint patterns. By the time Francis Galton got round to it and produced his first book, Fingerprint Directors, in 1895, the science of fingerprints was nascent but established, and the first police forces were using it in Argentina, which was the first country in the world to use fingerprints, thanks to Juan Vucetich. And then Scotland Yard adopted it in England in 1901. So at the time, this is contemporary with Benham, this is contemporary with Cairo. The time they were writing their books, fingerprint patterns were known about, and Benham even includes a picture of a triradius to be found on the mount of a finger. So he's looking at the mount of the palm, and he's noticing the triradii, and he doesn't say anything about them. And Cairo's got lots of handprints, and you can see the fingerprint patterns on the hands that he's taken handprints of, but he says nothing about them at all. He doesn't write about them at all. Fingerprints are completely ignored by all the 19th century palmists. They don't look at them at all. It's just morphogamy and lineation. So the introduction of the significance of fingerprint patterns doesn't come until about the 1920s, and it starts with Noel Jaquin. He's the first person who really writes about fingerprint patterns and understands something of their psychological significance. And simultaneously with that, you've got the medical dermatoglyphicists looking at fingerprint patterns too from a genetic point of view, following on from the forensic work of people like Francis Galton. Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin. He was also the chair of eugenics at London University. So whilst he developed the system of fingerprint patterns and classification that was used by Scotland Yard, his interest in it was, as many people's interest was at that time, in eugenics and genetic modification and improving the lot of the human race by modifying the genes of humanity. It wasn't the Germans who were the first people to do that. It was actually the British. So that was that's where the genetics of fingerprint patterns come in. And so it's interesting, therefore, to look at different books on palmistry, on handreading, and see what they have to say about fingerprint patterns. And it's almost like guaranteed, if they don't talk about fingerprint patterns, that means they're following the Victorian palmists or people who came before that, or they venerate that particular tradition more than anything else. But here's the problem with that. The lines of the hand change. And moreover, the more minor the line, the more subsidiary line, the more little the line is on the hand. If it's a little mark here or a stressed line there, or an island within a line, or a bar line across, as we saw in the handprints that we looked at before, all those lines, which are given incredible significance to do with events and things that have happened in someone's life, or maybe describing illnesses, and it's a huge amount. I mean, Benham's 650-page book, half of that book is on the drawings of little line features and what that all means. Those are not important because those things can change. Those things change much, much more rapidly than the major lines of the hand, for example. And whilst the major lines can change, and we've got plenty of evidence that they do change, they don't change as quickly or as much as the minor and subsidiary lines on the hand. And so it must be fairly obvious that if the lines that don't change must be more important and more significant, the ones that don't change as much are more important than the ones that change a lot, because the ones that change a lot are very ephemeral. They like to do with your stresses and your worries or your anxieties or your mental health or an illness that you may be suffering, or pregnancy. You can see the lines, the minor lines and subsidiary lines of the hands change during the course of a woman's pregnancy, as her body gets more stressed because she's carrying a fetus and hormonal changes that go with that. And then as the baby's born and the body recovers, then the lines of those stresses go away and the hands change again. So these are momentary phenomena, these subsidiary lines, these little lines that the palmists tend to focus on as being the most important lines of the hand. In medieval palmistry, they didn't make any distinction at all. They couldn't even recognize the main lines, but all palmists will recognize that the main lines of the hand, the lifeline, the headline, the heart line, the fate line, maybe one or two others as well. But everyone agrees that those 3 or 4 lines are the primary lines of the hand and practically always found in every hand. And therefore, they're more important because they're more enduring. They're more indelible markers of the person's character. So why don't they do that with fingerprints? It absolutely is not true that all these 3 things need to be considered equally. They're not of equal standing. Now, whilst the major lines may not change that much, they change a lot more than the fingerprint patterns because, as everybody knows, the fingerprint patterns don't change at all. You know this, everyone knows this. This is how the police use them for identification purposes. William Herschel did his studies in the 1860s and proved that the fingerprint patterns don't change. And on the basis of them not being changed, they were adopted by Scotland Yard for forensic identification purposes. And it's not only that they don't change, but they're unique to each individual. So it's not a very hard step to take to say, well, if the fingerprints are unique to each individual, they must describe something that is unique to each individual. And if they don't change and they're constant throughout one's life, that therefore then indicates that they must show something that is a characteristic of that person that stays with them for their entire life and doesn't change. And that's exactly what you find when you actually read hands. So it's not true that all the features of the hand should be read equally. They're not equally important. What's necessary, therefore, is to create a kind of hierarchy of what's important to look at in a hand. Now, the morphology of a hand, the shape and structure of your hand is largely going to be determined by your physical body and therefore your genetics. If you're a tall person, you have long, thin hands. If you're a short person, you have short hands. If you're a wide person, you have wide hands. If you're built like a brick shit house, you'll have big, strong, spade-like hands. You know, so the morphology of your palm, the shape and structure of the hand will reflect the morphology of your body, which will be very largely determined by your family and your genetics, and possibly even your race and the racial structures that you have, bone structures you get by virtue of being a big Samoan or a small, slight, skinny Indian. So there are lots of different variations in the hand shape, but they are largely going to be a reflection of the physical shape of the person and therefore the genetics of that person in a very physiological way. So I wouldn't expect hand shapes to change much. I mean, they do change as you grow from being a baby. Newborn babies' hands are usually quite square, and then they grow in shape, and the fingers can grow during childhood. So once the body has become an adult, the shape of the hands don't change much after that point, but they do change during that childhood period. So you end up with bent index fingers or short low set air fingers as a consequence of the sort of inhibitions to psychological functionings that cause the fingers to not grow in the way that they should during childhood years. So morphology pretty much doesn't change, but has some capacity for change, and therefore it changes slightly more than the fingerprint patterns. And the lines change more than everything. Doesn't matter what lines they are, they change. They can all change in lots of different kind of way. When I did my study on which lines of the hand change the most, the one that changes the most is actually the heart line or the major waterline. Every handprint I looked at in my study had some difference in that line. every single one. So the lines, therefore, must be considered to be more ephemeral and therefore less indicative of kind of like the true personality of the person. And so the morphology needs to be considered to be more primary, although a lot of that will be genetic, and a lot of that will be to do with the person's upbringing. And then the fingerprints must be considered to be essential. So if you look at it in that kind of way, the things that don't change are going to be the characteristics you have all through your life. The things that change hardly at all, but you've inherited from your parents, well, you're going to be we are largely determined by our genetics, and everyone, the doctor will always ask you what family medical history you got, because you're more likely to get the same illnesses and diseases that your parents did or die from the same kind of things. So that's useful to know what your genetics and family stock is. And by virtue of that, you inherit your body from the genetics of your parents, and so there'll be some similarities there. And the lines, well, the lines are to do with your experiences and how you understand your life. So they will change according to what your life experiences you have, and change in the way that your consciousness articulates to itself what's actually going on within your own experience. So that can change an awful lot. And that's not to say that the lines are not important, although they are important, but it's important. What is important is to get this kind of graded hierarchy of what you need to look at in a hand. And the fingerprint patterns, and that includes the palmar dermatoglyphic patterns, that includes the skin texture, anything to do with the skin ridges, need to be prioritized as being the most important things to look at in a hand. The morphology, the structure, the fingers, the thumb, the nails, they're secondary, and then the lines are tertiary, and within the lines, the major lines are most important, and then the subsidiary lines are less important. And that really is only a hierarchy by virtue of which ones change most frequently. So if you want to look at it from an elemental point of view, fingerprint patterns are like the earth, and the subsidiary lines are like the air. And the earth is constant, and the air is blowing around all the time and is highly changeable. So I went and saw Andrew Fitzherbert in June this year, and this was part of the discussion that he and I had at that same time as well, and he basically doesn't prioritize that's important. He thinks they are just as important, as significant as the lines as well. So he considers them all equally. So, and I think that's a mistaken view. But it's interesting to me that the people who think that the fingerprints are of equal importance to the lines are people whose palmistry approach derives mainly from the Victorian palmistry of Dapontigny, Devereux, Benham, and Cairo. And they're missing something by virtue of that.